შემდეგი მომხსენებელი გვყავს სტუმარი ბელგიიდან პროფესორი Jelle Creemersi, აკადემიური დეკანი ევანგელურ თეოლოგიურ უნივერსიტეტი, რელიგიისა და რწმენის თავისუფლების კვლევის ინსტიტუტი. გთხოვთ. თემა იქნება რელიგიური მრავალფეროვნება თანამედროვე საზოგადოებაში Martha Nussbaumის გაკვეთილი.
I'm very pleased to be able to join today in the Sola Forum conference again. I see many faces now that are familiar to me, and it's very nice to see you all again. And I'm also very glad to meet some new faces as well. As was said, my name is Jelle Creemers. I'm professor at the Evangelical Theological Faculty in Leuven in Belgium, and there I also coordinate, together with Tatjana Kopaleshvili, the Institute for the Study of Freedom of Religion or Belief, or ISFORB as we call it. And every year we organize a conference related to religious freedom issues. We have had quite some Georgian scholars and students participate there as well, including Professor Archil Metreveli, who came as a plenary speaker last year, or even 2 years ago, I think. And we look forward to continued cooperation. For those interested, our 2025 conference will take place 8th and 9th of May, and we will focus on the topic of FORB and vulnerability. So we hope some of you will join us again in Leuven. For this year, my contribution will focus on political philosophy, and it deals with a question that is challenging in every modern society, including my own Belgian society and also here in Georgia. I want to give attention to the general question of how in a modern society one should deal with religious diversity. And I want to approach this topic from an ethical philosophical perspective. And as a conversation partner, I chose Professor Martha Nussbaum. Martha Nussbaum is professor at the University of Chicago after having taught at Harvard and Brown University. I will make reference to some of her publications, but I will focus particularly on her work, The New Religious Intolerance, Overcoming the Politics of Fear in an Anxious Age, which was published by Harvard University Press. And the reason why I chose this book is the fact that it offers very general guidelines for political policies regarding religious diversity, which are based on ancient philosophical wisdom, particularly of Greek philosophers such as Socrates and Aristotle. So it is not particularly Christian, but it has more ancient roots. And actually her books speak in a critical, prophetic manner to the whole of Europe. From her perspective, Europe, including in particular Belgium and Switzerland, France, Italy, and Finland, are too often considered exemplary in view of human rights and religious freedom. And she disagrees with that. And she gives particular attention to the attitude in many European countries towards Islam and Muslims. And she sees that as a clear demonstration of what goes wrong in dealing with religious diversity and with religion-state relations. And she points to weaknesses, and she challenges us Europeans, so both Belgians and Georgians, to learn from classical philosophers and from North American thinkers. Now, just be sure that she does not say that the USA is the prime example of religious freedom either. The reality is often quite different from the theory, and she gives a lot of critical comments on the American situation as well in her book. But I found her analysis very helpful as a mirror for my own country, and I hope it may be useful for you as well, as you reflect on Georgia. She offers very helpful general guidelines on the way in which religious diversity can and should be dealt with today. Interesting in the work of Nussbaum is that she doesn't start her analysis from high ideals or from a complex ethical framework, but she starts from human emotions. Because, so she says, emotions are not just animalistic reactions. Emotions show us how vulnerable we are to events that we cannot control. Emotions can be contain an awareness of value and of judgments, and therefore they are very important in ethical reasoning. Emotions contain values of what is right and what is wrong, what is good and what is bad. But these emotional evaluations can also be right or wrong. And in this work, the starting point of her argument is a consideration of the emotion of fear. And actually in this I built on what Sobikos Viadadze said yesterday, the importance of fear in dealing with questions of religious freedom and religion-state relations. Fear is a very strong emotion, and fear can be very useful in life. Fear can help us to avoid or to run away from danger, for example. If we would not fear fire, or we would not fear car accidents, we would live quite dangerously and probably not very long. But fear can also be directed to a wrong object. And so Martha Nussbaum explains, fear needs to be examined. And it is the unexamined fear which can lead to aggressive othering strategies, as they are called, strategies in which we take distance from or look with disgust at people who are different from us. And that is not helpful at all in making the right decisions toward treating people. Fear can then also be used by leaders, Martha Nussbaum explains, in particular in politically sensitive situations. And political leaders do that by demonizing groups of others. They are the bad ones, they want to attack our country, they want to destroy us. And leaders then claim that they will rescue us from them and from their danger. In Belgium and in many Western European countries, this fear is stimulated and used by extreme right politicians who portray all of Islam and all Muslims as a danger which needs to be kept down and kept out. And in Georgia, fear is also instrumentalized in politics. The recent elections showed this very clearly in one party's advertisement. So Martha Nussbaum warns against unexamined fear. It is normal and good that people fear, but fear needs to be honestly examined to be sure that what you fear is indeed dangerous. We often fear what is different from us, and that can be people who behave differently, who believe differently, who pray differently, who act differently. In Belgium, as I said, Muslims with their religious particularities are feared, in particularly the wearing of headscarves. And burqas that fully cover the body are simply forbidden in the public sphere in Belgium. In Georgia, as far as I know, some create fear and disgust towards people with other sexual preferences, fear of outward enemies, and their so-called local presence in foreign agents, religious or not, and we heard about it from Archel. Therefore, Nussbaum says that examining fear and dealing with it in a proper way is particularly important to keep a democracy running. For if people vote and they make laws purely on the basis of unexamined fear, there will be groups of people who are feared and labeled without good reason and who will suffer, which means that society will suffer. So it's clear that in many countries, and again I think both in my Belgium and in your Georgia, there are some who try to create this climate of fear which is dangerous to the modern democratic society. But what then should we do about this? How can potential objects of fear be examined in a proper way? Nussbaum points to three elements which I will discuss shortly. The first is sound principles. The second is what she calls a non-narcissistic soundness of principle. And third, the cultivation of an inner perspective. I will explain. First, in view of sound principles, Nussbaum explains that the principles which she pleads for are more American than European. In view of dealing with religious diversity, and particularly religious minorities, she says, Europe has used some strategies which can be understood but are to be considered insufficient. And one of them is the principle of assimilation. People just need to adjust, assimilate. They need to take over the local customs to be accepted as good people, without critically asking why which assimilation is required, why it should be necessary. A nice example of that, I think, is the headscarf. Most schools in Belgium, students are not allowed to wear any headscarves. But just one generation ago, when I was growing up, I was taught in school by Catholic nuns, all of them wearing headscarves. Then one needs to have very good reason to explain why some headscarves require assimilation and others didn't. The second principle that has often played in European history to deal with religious diversity was the principle of geographic distribution. Concrete example was the Peace of Augsburg Treaty in 1555. It said that people could remain Catholic or Protestant if they wanted to, but if their local prince was of the other faith, then the people would have to move to another region. People can choose what they believe, but it has implications for where they can live. These principles, European principles, cannot and should not be enough, says Martha Nussbaum. And she pleads then for sound principles, the first of which is all people are equal bearers of human dignity, independent of wealth, class, talent, power, prestige, or morals. Now, what this human dignity exactly means and why people have human dignity, there are many opinions on that, and those who are working on human rights know these discussions very well. But the fact that every person has human dignity is a basic principle we need to start from, as it goes against any dehumanizing of another person on the basis of their difference. Second principle is that it is the task of the government to respect our equality and dignity, which means in practice that the government should respect and protect and promote fundamental religious rights. Third principle, conscience is a crucial element related to human dignity, and conscience is very vulnerable. Therefore, personal conscience needs particular protection. And personal conscience is not just about something that is in our head, but it relates to our daily lives, to our rituals, to our community life, etc. We're now speaking of religious freedom, which, so Martha Nussbaum argues, needs to be as broad as possible and as equal as possible. And here she says European societies are really failing. There are generally two ways in which this broadness and equality can be imagined, particularly in the North American tradition. First is neutrality in the tradition of the 17th century British philosopher John Locke, who claims that equal protection of conscience requires two things. One, laws cannot make religious convictions punishables. And second, laws on religious affairs have to be equal for everyone. For example, a religious group cannot be forbidden to slaughter animals in a ritual manner, even if it is very bloody or very strange to us, if we are also allowed to slaughter animals for food. Or second, it cannot be forbidden for religious police officers to wear beards, for example, Muslims, if beards are also allowed for other police officers, for example, those who have skin disease which they want to hide. A second tradition of this religious freedom is a tradition of Roger Williams, the founder of the colony of Rhode Island in the 17th century, and he teaches something called religious accommodation. Religious accommodation goes further, and it means that laws cannot discriminate people just because they are in a religious minority. So, for example, if someone wants to have a religious holiday on an other day than Christian holidays, that should be allowed. And if everyone is supposed to take off their hats when they enter court, but a Quaker doesn't want to do that for religious reasons, then it should be allowed that he keeps wearing his hat. So this second tradition gives high priority to people's individual beliefs and freedoms and challenges policymakers and judges to give as much freedom as possible. Now, this second tradition is quite far from particularly European reality, and I also honestly feel uncomfortable with the extent to which it is used. But it is important to note how far religious freedom traditions can really go. The second point that Martha Nussbaum focuses on is impartiality. It means in particular that we need to do proper self-examination before we make any ethical decisions. Because we have a natural tendency, so it seems, to be more lenient for ourselves than we are for others. I think all of you who have children or work with teenagers recognize that. People tend to give themselves other treatments, other rules than they give others. Martha Nussbaum points to the Bible text, Matthew 7, verses 3 and 4, as a key example in case, which says, where Jesus says, "How can you remove the splinter in another person's eye if you have a plank in your own eye?" And also the philosopher Immanuel Kant focused on this as central to his ethical system. He says, "The principles by which you live should be the same principles by which you think all other people should live. We should not treat others with different measures, than we would treat ourselves. And in her work, Nussbaum discusses in detail the example of the burqa ban in European countries. And she explains that European governments and politicians and judges and scholars use arguments to forbid the burqa for women, and they use arguments on safety, on transparency, on objectification of women. They speak about social pressure, and they speak about health. And she explains that, strangely enough, people don't use the same arguments for other dress codes, such as high heels. High heels for women can also be considered undesirable in view of safety, in view of objectification of women, in view of social pressure, in view of health. And shawls and sunglasses can also make people unrecognizable in the public sphere, but we don't care about it if it's not a burqa. I cannot get into details on this now, but it's something to really think about. I would be, by the way, very curious to hear how people look at religious clothing in Georgia, be it Muslim or Christian or Hindu or other. The third principle that is necessary for reasoned argumentations about religious diversity, according to Martha Nussbaum, is empathy. Empathy, so Martha Nussbaum explains, moves in exactly the opposite direction of fear. Fear moves away from people. It refuses to see people as they are, but you see them as a danger. Empathy is to move towards people, where we seek to see the world through their eyes, seek to understand their actions on the basis of their personal situation, their context, and their will. This may mean that some actions which we may consider disrespectful in other circumstances may need to be reconsidered. And she gives the example of a Jewish boy at a sports game in the United States. And he wears a sports cap over his kippah. So he has a kippah and a sports cap over it. And when the national anthem is being sung, he takes off his sports cap respectfully. But someone who has not been paying attention and only sees now that this boy is wearing a kippah, during the anthem may think it is very disrespectful that he has something on his head. While this boy tries to demonstrate the opposite, within the particularities of his religion, it can be misunderstood. I can imagine the same is true for some devout Muslims who refuse to shake hands with a woman. Many would say that they do that out of respect. They don't want to touch a woman who is not their wife. Instead, this Muslim may bow very deeply. Some, and also in Belgium, politicians would cry out some years ago in anger that this Muslim person refuses to shake hands with a woman, claiming he actually does it because he thinks women are inferior and dirty. And then suddenly Corona happened. And everybody began to greet one another respectfully without shaking hands. And suddenly this Muslim man's behavior was very normal and nobody would think it was disrespectful. Martha Nussbaum explains in her book that one way to really learn this kind of empathy, this kind of inner eye, to really want to see from the perspective of someone who is different, is by reading books. Books that were written from the perspective of a minority religious person. Books which explained to us why they do some things and don't do other things. This does not claim that people are perfect or that religions only have good principles and valuable principles and rituals, but it should explain what they mean to people, and that is very helpful. I remember I had a discussion with an American student in my institution some years ago who was telling me that he could not understand that Protestants in Belgium would want to accept money from the government as a recognized religion. And I explained to him that it's part of the Belgian religion state system and that not getting governmental recognition and support puts a religion in Belgium very easily under the label of sect or a cult. And second, I told him, what you will never see in my country is a Belgian flag hanging in a church next to the pulpit. We would say that this is a very wrong mixture of religion and culture. Religion and nationalism. But that, again, is very normal in the US. And he had never thought about it that way. So empathy requires us to come close enough to the other person to listen and hear him, and therefore it is the opposite of fear. Let me close with a conclusion. As we can learn from Martha Nussbaum, fear can be a positive and a useful emotion, but we and also our leaders need to also think about our emotions, why we fear. Because unreasoned fear may lead to othering and aggression towards those who are different just because they are different. Martha Nussbaum offers 3 guidelines that can help us to reason about our fears and their objects and to see if our fear is indeed needed. And if not, we should be open to give people the same space that we want ourselves. Also, if they have very different religious convictions or habits and rituals. These guidelines are first, equal religious freedom for everybody, and of course that also includes freedom for those who are not religious. Second, impartiality, which means that we don't treat others differently than we would want to be treated ourselves. And third, empathy, which means that we try to see the world through other people's eyes and understand why they may think or act or dress differently. Now, these principles that I just explained are actually very simple. But it is this simplicity which makes it so powerful. They can help us and our leaders, religious leaders, political leaders, other leaders, to think and live on the basis of a deep respect for all people's dignity and their fundamental rights. I thank you for your attention and look forward to questions or comments.
დიდი მადლობა შესანიშნავი მოხსენებისთვის. თუ არის შეკითხვები? ჩვენ ნამდვილად ცხოვრობთ ფობიების ქვეყანაში. ყველა კულტურას თავისი ფობია აქვს ალბათ. და ჩვენთვის აქტუალური იყო ეს თემა. დიდი მადლობა პროფესორ იელეს ამ მოხსენებისთვის. მადლობთ.